whether slavery should exist in these newly found states like Kansas and Nebraska, which pretty much, as you can imagine, a bunch of people who really, 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 really hated the idea of slavery and a bunch of people who really, really, really loved the idea of slavery all came literally rushing to the same place at one time to fight for their beliefs. What could possibly go wrong? But in exchange, though, this wasn't the only thing that happened. It enacted a stricter Fugitive Slave Act in this compromise. It also gave Texas monetary compensation to drop its claims to be to part of New Mexico's territory. The Fugitive Slave Act was a very controversial law that constituted part of the Compromise of 1850. It required that escaped slaves, upon their capture, would be returned to their masters, and the authorities in a free state had to cooperate with the process. So pretty much, even if it's a free state, most of the population violently opposed to slavery. People from the South would come up with bloodhounds. It was nicknamed the Bloodhound Law by abolitionists for the common use of using dogs to hunt down such slaves and return them back to their masters in the South. So you really could not escape from the evil of slavery. The Great Triumvirate was a collective label for Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. The three statesmen dominated U.S. politics in the 19th century prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, and they played vital roles in everything from the nullification crisis to the Compromise of 1850. So that's Henry Clay, John Calhoun, and Daniel Webster. As this was going on, William Stewart was rising to prominence. He was a radical abolitionist New York senator. He argued that slavery should be banned on moral grounds. Initially a Whig, he joined the Republican Party back in 1855. Stewart served as Secretary of State from 1861 to 69. He was one of the officials targeted by John Wilkes Booth's conspiracy, but narrowly survived multiple stab wounds. He masterminded the purchase of Alaska in 1867, an act initially named Stewart's Folly, but actually trying to be very, very good because of natural resources there. 13th President Millard Fillmore was in office at the time, pretty much irrelevant. Stephen Douglas was a senator from Illinois, nicknamed Little Giant. He was notable for creating the Kansas-Nebraska Acts, which is the popular sovereignty, which pretty much functionally repealed the Missouri Compromise. The act proposed Nebraska territory would be divided into two regions, Nebraska and Kansas, and each would vote by popular sovereignty on the issue of slavery. It presumed that Nebraska would become a free state while Kansas would become a slave state. Douglas was able to push the bill through Congress, and President Pierce signed it into law, helped spur the formation of the Republican Party, obviously leading to a lot of violence along the way. So while all this was going on, there was a real resistance to slavery in the form of the Underground Railroad, an attempt by abolitionists and slaves to circumvent the Fugitive Slave Act, which assisted slaves in escaping to the North and helping find freedom. Also at this time, literature was a form of resistance by way of Harriet Beecher Stowe, an American abolitionist and author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, an influential work of abolitionism. So Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. This novel expressed the northern abolitionist frustrations with the Fugitive Slave Act. In the North, the novel quickly gained fame, and Queen Elizabeth even committed, she said she cried reading the book. Like, it was a massive book. It was the second most popular book in the country to only the Bible. Meanwhile, in the South, though, the commitment to protecting the institution of slavery intensified because people were like, they're really starting to turn on our way of life now, which is very economically profitable, so people would go very, very far to protect it. The Republican Party formed at this time. It was known as the GOP, the Grand Old Party. It emerged as from the renewed sectional tension in 1850. It was founded in 1854 by anti-slavery Whigs, Democrats, Free Soilers, and Know-Nothings from the North and the West. Though the GOP lost the 1856 presidential election, the popular John C. Fremont garnered many votes and won 11 of the 16 free states in the Electoral College. But they would win in 1860. So James Buchanan was the 15th president. He was a long career of public service and a statesman. He essentially won his party's nomination due to being abroad for so long, meaning he wasn't really tied to any of the contentious domestic issues of the 1850s, so he was kind of come in. He didn't have really strongly stated positions on these things. He supported the Dred Scott ruling and the entry of Kansas into the Union as a slave state. He was often ranked the worst president for exacerbating regional tensions in the run-up to the Civil War and then doing nothing to stop the secession. So he was really just kind of powerless and very ineffective. Henry Ward Beecher was an abolitionist and clergyman. In response to pro-slavery border ruffians moving into Kansas and Missouri, he helped anti-slavery settlers establish foothold in the states and also funneled them rifles. Beecher attacked the Compromise of 1850 in Shall We Compromise, arguing that a Christian's duty to feed and shelter slaves meant that liberty and slavery were compatible. Pretty much they had a moral responsibility to help these slaves. Bleeding Kansas was a nickname for a period of bloody conflict in what became Kansas. It was the violence that I was talking about, since the idea that slavery in a state would be decided by a vote of the people who live there. A bunch of pro-slavery people and a bunch of abolitionists came in from all across the country, mostly the North and the South, obviously, fought it out pretty much in a very, very violent ways. And then that eventually kind of blew up. Another big Supreme Court decision happened around this time, a landmark 1857 Supreme Court case that was a major contributing factor in the outbreak of the Civil War. Dred Scott, a slave in Missouri, spent years in Wisconsin and Illinois with his master. After his again, these are free states. After his master's death, Dred Scott sued for freedom. The court ruled that all African American, free or slave, were not citizens. Taney also ruled, so this is Roger Taney, we'll talk about him in a minute, that Congress had no right to deny citizens of their individual property, and therefore that Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional for stripping slave owners of their rightful property once they moved north. Roger Taney, he made this ruling. He was 5th Chief Justice, and it was very, very rough and it was really kind of infamous for the majority opinion. For his majority opinion in Dred Scott versus Sanford. Not a good legacy in history to have. His attempt to overturn Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus in Maryland was also ignored by Lincoln. The South also loathed him for siding with the Union, so he couldn't really win, even though he made an incredibly pro-slavery decision. He was just an unpopular guy all around. John Brown was an abolitionist who believed that arming slaves was the only way to get rid of slavery. He became famous for leading a small band of fighters in Bleeding, Kansas, killing several pro-slavery supporters in 1859. He led a raid on Harpers Ferry, intending to take its weapons to equip slaves on nearby plantations. Brown's raid was quickly suspended, but excited national furor, especially after he was executed. So pretty much give people the idea in the South that Northerners would literally come down and go to great lengths to start slave uprisings all over the place. These crazy abolitionists, which pushed them further to war, although that wasn't really the case. Harpers Ferry was a federal arsenal in Virginia. John Brown planned to use it to arm slaves on surrounding plantations with the hope of generating a slave rebellion. Ultimately, he aimed to overthrow the institution of slavery. In October 1859, Brown led a march to Harpers Ferry and seized this arsenal. However, Brown and his followers were captured by the Virginia militia, tried for treason, and hanged. Robert E. Lee was in command of those opposition forces, funnily enough. So during the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1860, Lincoln challenged Douglas to rationalize the concept of popular sovereignty, which is, again, the idea of people who lived in certain states could decide whether or not they wanted their states to be slave states. That's kind of the basis there of the Freeport Doctrine. That was a key establishment in the slavery legal history, but it's not a very big deal, so we'll kind of move past that. Let's get you the key figures now in the secession of the South. The Confederate States of America, an illegal, unrecognized state that existed from 1861 to 1865. It attempted to secede from the United States in order to preserve the institution of slavery, as explicitly stated in the secession declarations of several states. It was led by Jefferson Davis, and its capital was in Richmond, Virginia. Its members included Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. It attempted to lay claim to territory in the American Southwest, as well as Kentucky and Missouri. Union loyalists in Virginia counter-seceded from the CSA to form West Virginia. So that's how West Virginia was formed there. Jefferson Davis was the sole president of the Confederate States. He served from February 22nd, 1862, from May 10th, 1865. He was a Democrat from Mississippi, a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He had served in the House and the Senate, as well as of Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. He was a micromanager who hampered the Confederate war effort, interestingly enough, by refusing to delegate issues or authority to subordinates. He's like, I'm going to handle everything. And it didn't work so well. John Calhoun was a South Carolina politician and member of the Great Triumvirate. He was an ardent supporter of states' rights, nullification, and slavery, one of the biggest racist people in American public history. From his deathbed, Calhoun wrote fierce attacks upon the proposed compromise of 1850, affirmed the right of secession, and pretty much talked about how much black people really did suck in his eyes. So the Civil War in Fort Sumter is where it began, a seaport near Charleston, South Carolina, where the first shots of the Civil War were fired. The Confederate Army fired upon the unarmed merchant vessel Star of the West, which was attempting to resupply U.S. forces stationed in the fort. So this is key here for Abraham Lincoln, because he wanted to not be the one who fired the first shot of the war, but he would be the one to finish the war in the end. New York City erupted into rioting from July 13th to 16th, 1863. It was started primarily by Irish immigrants. Hundreds were killed and entire city blocks were destroyed by the fire. The rioters feared the newly emancipated African Americans would undercut them in the labor market, and they resented that wealthy men were able to buy exemptions from the new military draft in the Civil War. So there was some interesting tension there in New York City. Copperheads at this time were on the rise. Northern Democrats who demanded a peace settlement with the Confederacy. The term was a pejorative coined by Republicans who likened the anti-war Democrats to the venomous copperhead snake, but adopted by Democrats as a symbol of liberty, owing to the Liberty head large cent copper coins in circulation at the time, trying to make it a proud thing, believe it or not. The Battle of Bull Run, the Battle of Manassas, is sometimes known in Confederate histories. But the first Battle of Bull Run took place in July 21st, 1861. It was an early Confederate victory in the Civil War, showing the North that this would be a long and bloody war, but the Southerners felt very emboldened by their victory. Union forces had expected an easy victory, and many congressmen and D.C. elites actually brought their families along to hold picnics to watch the battle, but they were sorely mistaken in their original impressions of the war. Stonewall Jackson was a Confederate general who worked under Robert E. Lee until his death in 1863. He was involved in every major battle in the eastern theater of the war. He was considered an able officer by military historians. He was accidentally shot by Confederate soldiers in 1863. He lost his arm and died from infection shortly thereafter. That's a mistake. Anyway, so Winfield Scott was a U.S. Army general with a storied career in the 19th century. He commanded troops in the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. He was too old for field service during the Civil War. He served as a strategist and mastermind for the defense of Washington, D.C. This Winfield Scott, he formed the Anaconda Plan. It was a four-phase plan to defeat the Confederacy. Phase 1 had the U.S. Navy blockading all southern ports. Phase 2 had the Navy split the Confederacy in half by taking control of the Mississippi River. Phase 3 had the Union Army cut through Georgia and travel up the coast to the Carolinas. And Phase 4 saw the Union capture the Confederate capital of Richmond. All those plans were successful. The Anaconda of the Union strangled the South, and the war was won. George McClellan was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. McClellan is famous for a short tenure as General-in-Chief of the Union Army during the Civil War. He was a meticulous planner, taking care to plan his operations and train his men. However, he was very timid on the battlefield and frequently overestimated the strength of Confederate forces. Lincoln removed him as General-in-Chief of the Union Army after Antietam, which was a Civil War battle that took place on September 17, 1862. Single bloodiest battle in U.S. history, killing 22,717. Despite stopping Robert E. Lee's invasion of Maryland,